No one could tame the beast. No one, until a quiet child stepped forward. Thunder was a legend in the small town, a wild stallion that no one could control. The ranchers had tried everything. The most experienced trainers had stepped into his enclosure, only to leave bruised and defeated. Some called him unbreakable. Others, like Mr. Blake, the ranch owner, had a simpler word: dangerous. "We can't keep him here," Mr. Blake muttered, watching the black stallion stomp and rear up in defiance. "He's a lost cause." The ranch workers nodded in agreement. It was time to sell Thunder before someone got seriously hurt. Then, on an ordinary afternoon, a boy arrived at the ranch. Eli was different. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words came softly, carefully chosen. He often kept to himself, preferring quiet over noise, observation over action. His mother, Grace, led him by the hand, her voice gentle as she spoke to Mr. Blake. "He loves animals," she said. "Horses, especially." Mr. Blake sighed, glancing toward Thunder's enclosure. "This ain't the kind of horse you want your boy near, ma'am. That stallion." But before he could finish, Eli pulled away from his mother's grasp and walked straight to the fence. The ranch hands froze. "Kid, get back," one of them shouted. But Eli didn't seem to hear. His eyes, wide with wonder, locked onto Thunder's fiery gaze. The stallion, who had been pacing restlessly, suddenly stopped. For the first time that anyone could remember, Thunder stood still. The air grew tense. Everyone expected the worst. They had seen this horse lash out at fully grown men. If the boy startled him, it could end in disaster. But Eli didn't flinch. He didn't back away. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to the ground and just sat there. Minutes passed. The ranch workers exchanged nervous glances. This was ridiculous. The horse was unpredictable, dangerous. Any second now, he'd. Thunder exhaled sharply and took a step closer. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mr. Blake furrowed his brows, stepping forward as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. No one, not a single soul, had ever seen Thunder approach a human on his own. The stallion's ears twitched, his muscles tense yet curious. Another step forward. And then another. Eli didn't move. He just watched, quiet and unafraid. By now, Grace had a hand over her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. She had always known her son was special, that he had a way of seeing the world differently. But this was something else. Then, without warning, Thunder lowered his massive head, just inches from Eli. The crowd held its breath. For the first time, the untamed stallion wasn't fighting. He wasn't thrashing or bucking. He was simply watching. And so was Eli. No words were spoken. No commands were given. Just an understanding, silent, but undeniable. Mr. Blake took off his hat, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know what's happening here," he muttered. "But I'd be a fool to stop it." The workers remained speechless, their skepticism wavering in the face of something they couldn't explain. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, Thunder did something that sent chills down everyone's spine. He let out a deep, slow breath, and bowed his head. The wild stallion, untamed and unbroken, was acknowledging the boy in a way no one had ever seen before. Eli simply smiled. And in that moment, the world changed. The ranch had never been so quiet. Everyone stood frozen, watching the unthinkable unfold. Thunder, the untamable beast, had lowered his head to a child. The same horse that had thrown off expert riders, that had nearly broken fences in his rage, was now standing still, before a boy who hadn't said a single word. Mr. Blake's fingers tightened around his hat. "This ain't real," he muttered under his breath. But it was. Eli, small and still, sat cross-legged in the dirt, watching Thunder with unblinking eyes. The horse flicked his ears, shifting slightly, but never backed away. He should be running, one of the workers whispered. He should be charging, another muttered. But Thunder did neither. Instead, he did something even more shocking. He took another step forward. Eli's mother, Grace, held her breath, her hands clasped together. Eli, she whispered, unsure if she should call him back. But Eli wasn't afraid. His fingers lightly traced circles in the dirt, his body relaxed. He wasn't looking away, wasn't flinching. For the first time, Thunder seemed curious. The stallion exhaled again, his powerful body shifting as he lowered himself onto his knees, not in fear, not in submission, but as if testing the space between them. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Mr. Blake, who had spent his whole life breaking wild horses, shook his head in disbelief. "This ain't normal," he murmured. "That horse don't trust nobody." A worker named Tucker scoffed, arms crossed. "It's just a fluke. The horse'll go back to his old self tomorrow." But the next day, Thunder waited by the fence. And the next. And the next. Every afternoon, Eli returned to the ranch with his mother. He never tried to touch Thunder. Never tried to control him. He simply sat by the fence, humming softly to himself. And every day, Thunder inched a little closer. By the end of the week, the once wild stallion was standing just inches from the boy. The other ranch hands watched in silence, struggling to make sense of it. Some of them had been thrown off that horse. Some had scars to prove it. But now, Thunder was calm. Tucker wasn't convinced. "He's just getting used to people bein' around him. Kid ain't doin' anything special." Mr. Blake wasn't sure. "I've trained horses for 30 years, he muttered. "I've never seen one act like this." Grace finally spoke up. "Eli's different," she said softly. "He sees the world in a way we don't." Tucker snorted. "That don't mean nothing. That horse'll never let anyone ride him. Mark my words." But Mr. Blake wasn't so sure anymore. That night, long after the ranch had gone quiet, he found himself staring out the window toward Thunder's enclosure. The stallion stood alone in the moonlight, his dark mane flickering in the wind. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't restless. He was standing still. Waiting. For Eli. And for the first time, Mr. Blake wondered if the boy might just be the one to do the impossible. Morning sunlight poured over the rolling hills as the ranch workers began their daily chores. The sound of hooves against dirt, the calls of ranchers, and the rustling of hay filled the air. But one thing had changed. Thunder wasn't pacing. The once wild stallion stood calmly by the fence, ears twitching as he scanned the dirt road leading up to the ranch. Waiting. Mr. Blake leaned against a wooden post, arms crossed. "I don't believe it," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't the only one. Tucker kicked at the dirt, shaking his head. "I'm tellin' you, boss. It's a fluke. That horse ain't changed. Just wait, he'll snap out of it." But as soon as a familiar figure appeared in the distance, something remarkable happened. Thunder perked up, his head lifting high. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he moved toward the fence. Eli had arrived. The boy, quiet as ever, walked the same path he had every day that week. His mother followed behind, her expression unreadable. The workers stopped what they were doing. Even the horses in the nearby stables seemed to sense the shift in the air. Eli approached the fence, and as if drawn by an invisible force, Thunder stepped forward to meet him. No hesitation. No rearing. No fear. The stallion, who had once lashed out at anyone who dared to approach, was now willingly standing before a child. Whispers spread among the workers. "I don't believe it," one muttered. "Boss," another ranch hand said to Mr. Blake, "you seein' this?" Mr. Blake didn't respond. He was staring, his grip tightening around the brim of his hat. Eli didn't try to touch Thunder. He never did. Instead, he simply sat down on the grass, his small hands folding neatly in his lap. Thunder, the most unpredictable horse on the ranch, lowered his head once more. Then, for the first time, Eli reached out. A small hand. A massive stallion. The connection lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Thunder let out a deep breath, his muscles relaxing as Eli's fingers brushed against his muzzle. The entire ranch held its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, Eli pulled his hand back and returned to simply watching. The stallion didn't move away. He stayed. Mr. Blake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't understand it," he admitted. Grace finally spoke. "Maybe you don't have to." Tucker, however, wasn't convinced. His jaw clenched. "So what? The kid sits near him, and the horse don't run? That don't mean nothin'. If the boy's got some kind of magic touch, let's see him ride it." The challenge hung in the air. Mr. Blake frowned. "Ain't nobody ridin' that horse, Tucker." Tucker smirked. "Then it don't mean a thing." He turned on his heel and stalked off, but the doubt in his voice couldn't hide the truth. What he had just seen shook him. The other workers lingered, watching Eli and Thunder in stunned silence. The stallion had chosen the boy. But the question remained, why? And what would happen if someone tried to test that bond? The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden light over the ranch. The workers had returned to their duties, but their minds were elsewhere. The sight of the untamable Thunder standing still beside a quiet boy had shaken them all. Mr. Blake watched from the porch, his hat held loosely in one hand. He had spent decades training horses, but never, not once, had he seen anything like this. Tucker, still fuming from the morning's events, muttered as he cleaned the stable. "Just wait," he grumbled. "That horse'll turn on him." But Thunder didn't. Every day, Eli returned. Every day, he sat by the fence. And every day, Thunder waited for him. It was as if the boy and the stallion had formed a silent pact, one that no one else could understand. The workers tried to make sense of it. "He ain't like this with nobody else," one said, scratching his head. "He let the kid touch him," another added, still in disbelief. Tucker scoffed. "That don't mean nothin'. Horse probably just tired." But Mr. Blake wasn't so sure anymore. The first test. A week later, the ranch owner decided to push the limits. "Let the boy in the pen," he said one morning, his voice quiet but firm. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. "You sure, boss?" Mr. Blake nodded. "I need to see something. Grace hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe?" "If it ain't," Mr. Blake said, "we'll know real quick." Eli didn't react. He simply waited as one of the workers unlatched the gate. A single step. Then another. Thunder watched, ears flicking back, muscles tensing. The boy took one more step, crossing the invisible threshold that had kept the ranchers at bay for months. The tension was unbearable. And then, Thunder snorted. Not in anger. Not in fear. But in recognition. Eli stopped. He didn't rush. He didn't reach out. He just stood there, as if waiting for the stallion to decide the next move. The great black horse hesitated. Then, slowly, he lowered his head toward the boy. The air was thick with disbelief. Mr. Blake clenched his jaw. "I don't understand it," he murmured. Tucker's eyes were wide. That's not possible." But it was happening. Eli raised his hand again, just as he had days before. And this time, Thunder didn't just let him touch his muzzle, he leaned into the boy's palm. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. For the first time, the untamable beast was seeking comfort from a child. Jealousy and recklessness. Not everyone was amazed. Tucker's hands balled into fists. He had spent months trying to break that horse. He had endured bruises, cuts, even broken ribs because of it. And now, this boy, this quiet, strange boy, had done what no man could do. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, Tucker made a decision. If the kid thought he had control over Thunder, then it was time to prove him wrong. No horse could be truly tamed without being ridden. And Tucker was going to be the first one on its back. No matter what it took, the moon hung low over the ranch, casting silver light over the empty fields. The wind whistled through the wooden fences, but the night was quiet. Too quiet. Tucker moved through the shadows, his boots making barely a sound against the dirt. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he didn't care. If that kid could get close to Thunder, then so could he. He had worked with horses his whole life. He had broken the wildest of them, bent them to his will. And yet, somehow, a boy who barely spoke had done what no trainer could. It made no sense. Tucker clenched his jaw, gripping the rope in his hands. He was going to prove, once and for all, that Thunder was just another animal, one that could be controlled, one that could be ridden. He slipped into the enclosure, heart pounding. Thunder was asleep near the fence, his large body still. Tucker smirked. Too easy. Moving slowly, he uncoiled the rope, preparing to slip it around the stallion's thick neck. He had broken wild horses before. A quick pull, a forceful yank, and Thunder would learn who was boss. But the second the rope brushed against Thunder's skin, the stallion's eyes flew open. With a piercing shriek, Thunder reared up, his hooves slamming into the ground so hard that Tucker lost his balance. The horse's eyes burned with fury. This wasn't the calm, quiet Thunder that stood beside Eli. This was the beast Tucker had always known. A wild, untamed force of nature. Tucker barely had time to scramble to his feet before Thunder lunged. The ranch worker dove out of the way just in time, rolling through the dirt. He cursed under his breath, scrambling toward the fence. Damn horse! Thunder spun, nostrils flaring, tail whipping behind him. He didn't charge again, but he didn't back down, either. Tucker's chest heaved as he pressed himself against the wooden beams. His hands shook. He had always known Thunder was dangerous, but this was different. There was no fear in Thunder's eyes. Only rage. The ranch worker didn't wait to see what would happen next. With a final glare, he climbed over the fence and stalked away. But he wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't over. The morning after. The next morning, the entire ranch was buzzing. Someone had tried to get close to Thunder last night. Mr. Blake found the rope near the enclosure, half buried in the dirt. The workers murmured among themselves, their eyes shifting toward one person. Tucker. Mr. Blake stepped forward. You got something to say? Tucker shrugged, crossing his arms. That horse ain't tamed, he muttered. He nearly trampled me last night. Grace's face paled. She turned to Eli, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. That's because you scared him, she said. Tucker scoffed. Oh, so the horse only listens to him, huh? He pointed at Eli. That's not real. Horses don't pick people. They need training. They need to be broken in. Eli said nothing, his eyes fixed on the ground. Mr. Blake exhaled through his nose. You went into the pen without my say-so, he said. That's dangerous. You could have gotten yourself killed. Tucker didn't flinch. If the kid's so special, let's see him ride it. Silence fell over the ranch. Eli looked up, his wide eyes blinking in the sunlight. Grace tensed. "He doesn't need to prove anything," she said firmly. But Mr. Blake was watching Eli carefully. Thunder had never let anyone near him. But this boy. Maybe, just maybe. Mr. Blake crouched down to Eli's level. "Son," he said gently, "do you want to try?" The boy looked toward the fence, where Thunder stood watching. Eli's lips parted. Then, for the first time that anyone on the ranch had ever heard, he spoke. "Thunder will let me." A hush fell over the workers. Even Tucker looked stunned. Eli turned to his mother, his small hand gripping hers. "I want to try." Grace's heart clenched. She had never forced Eli to do anything. She had always let him decide his own way, his own time. And now, for the first time, he had made a choice. Mr. Blake nodded. "All right." Tucker smirked. "This'll be good." But deep down, even he wasn't sure anymore. Because nothing about this was normal. And as Eli walked toward the fence, Thunder didn't move away. He was waiting. For him. A hush fell over the ranch as Eli stepped forward. The boy moved with quiet confidence, his small hands hanging at his sides. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hesitant. Thunder watched him closely, ears twitching, muscles tense, but not in fear. In understanding. Mr. Blake had seen thousands of horses in his lifetime, but never had he seen one wait for someone like this. The workers stood frozen, eyes darting between the boy and the beast. Even Tucker, who had been so sure this was a fluke, felt the doubt creeping into his chest. Eli reached the fence and, without hesitation, climbed up onto the lowest rail. His small frame looked even smaller against the sheer size of Thunder. The stallion exhaled, his nostrils flaring. A test. A challenge. Eli lifted his hand and held it out, palm open, offering nothing but trust. The wind whistled through the dry fields, stirring Thunder's dark mane. And then, the great stallion stepped forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Thunder had never willingly come to anyone before. Not Mr. Blake. Not the trainers. No one. But now, he was closing the distance himself. Slowly, carefully, he pressed his massive head against Eli's outstretched hand. The boy didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. Instead, he did something no one expected. He whispered. No one could hear the words. Not the workers. Not his mother. Not even Mr. Blake, who had leaned in just slightly, straining to catch them. But whatever Eli said, it meant something to Thunder. Because the stallion, who had kicked, reared, and fought every human who had tried to control him, lowered his head. Not in fear. Not in defeat. But in respect. A sign of trust. Mr. Blake swallowed hard. Sweet mercy, he muttered. Grace covered her mouth, her heart pounding. She had always known her son saw the world differently, but this was something beyond her understanding. Eli, still whispering, slowly slid one leg over the fence and into the enclosure. The workers tensed. Tucker's eyes widened. Kid, don't, someone started. But before anyone could stop him, Eli slid off the fence and landed softly on the dirt. Inside the pen. With Thunder. The entire ranch held its breath. Mr. Blake took an instinctive step forward, ready to pull the boy away if things went south. But Eli wasn't in danger. He was exactly where he needed to be. Thunder, a creature of pure power, of unbreakable spirit, didn't move. Didn't charge. Didn't react in anger. He simply turned his head. And nudged Eli's shoulder. The boy let out a soft giggle, the first real sound he had made since stepping into the pen. And then, the stallion bent his front legs and lowered himself onto the ground. A stunned silence settled over the ranch. No one moved. No one spoke. Because they all knew what this meant. A wild horse did not kneel unless it had chosen its master. Eli had passed the test. And now, the next one awaited. Mr. Blake swallowed hard and finally found his voice. "Son," he said carefully, "do you want to ride him?" Eli turned, his blue eyes full of something no one had ever seen in him before. Confidence. "Yes," he said simply. Grace's breath hitched. Tucker's throat went dry. And Thunder? Thunder stayed perfectly still, waiting for the boy to take his place. The ranch had never been this silent. Eli stood in the enclosure, his small frame dwarfed by the massive stallion beside him. Thunder, once feared for his uncontrollable nature, was now still, waiting. Mr. Blake exhaled. "All right, son," he said slowly. "You said you want to ride him." His voice was steady, but inside, his heart pounded. This was madness. A week ago, Thunder would have trampled anyone who came too close. Now, he was lowering himself, inviting a child onto his back. Tucker scoffed, shaking his head. "This ain't gonna end well." Grace clutched her hands together. "Eli," she whispered. "Are you sure?" Eli nodded once. Then, without hesitation, he moved. The boy placed his hands on Thunder's muscular back. The stallion flicked his ears but didn't flinch. The workers watched in stunned silence. Eli took a deep breath, bent his knees, and climbed. The moment his small legs swung over Thunder's back, the ranch held its breath. Would Thunder buck? Would he rear? Would he throw the boy off and prove that no human could ever tame him? For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, Thunder stood up. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The powerful stallion rose to his full height. Eli balanced on his back, small hands gripping the stallion's thick mane. No saddle. No reins. No force. Just trust. The workers exchanged nervous glances. They had seen expert riders thrown off lesser horses in seconds. But Eli wasn't struggling. He wasn't afraid. He was calm. Then, just when it seemed like the impossible had already happened, Thunder began to walk. Mr. Blake nearly dropped his hat. No one had ever ridden this horse. And now, here he was, carrying Eli as if the boy had been meant to sit on his back all along. "Holy hell," one worker muttered. Grace's hands trembled. She had spent years worrying that Eli would never find a place where he belonged, that the world would never understand him. But Thunder did. The stallion moved in slow, deliberate steps, carefully adjusting to the weight of the child. The workers trailed behind the enclosure, unsure whether to be terrified or in awe. Tucker's face twisted with disbelief. "No way," he muttered. "That horse is fakin' it. The kid's gonna fall." Just then, a gust of wind whipped through the ranch, slamming a loose barn door against the wooden frame with a loud bang. Thunder froze. His muscles tensed. His ears flicked backward. And in an instant, the stallion reared up. Gasps filled the air. Eli's small body was thrown backward, his grip slipping. "Eli!" Grace screamed. Mr. Blake's gut clenched. He had seen men get trampled this way. If the boy fell. But just before Eli could hit the ground, something unbelievable happened. Thunder didn't buck him off. Instead, the stallion twisted mid-rear, shifting his weight. And caught Eli on his back. A controlled movement. A decision. The ranch fell into stunned silence. Mr. Blake could hardly breathe. Thunder landed back on all fours, and Eli, still clutching the horse's mane, was safe. The workers looked at each other, unable to believe what they had just seen. Tucker opened his mouth, but for the first time, he had nothing to say. Grace collapsed against the fence, tears filling her eyes. And Eli? The boy simply ran his small fingers down Thunder's mane and whispered something only the horse could hear. The great stallion snorted, shook his head, and took another step forward. Like nothing had happened. Like they had always been meant to do this. Mr. Blake wiped his face with a shaky hand. "I don't know what I just saw," he murmured, "but I'll be damned if it ain't the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." Because Thunder hadn't just let the boy ride him. He had protected him. And from that moment on, no one, not even Tucker, could deny it. Thunder belonged to Eli. And Eli belonged to him. But their greatest test was still to come. The entire ranch was in shock. No one spoke. No one moved. They had all seen it. Thunder had not only allowed Eli to ride him, but when the boy had nearly fallen, the great stallion had caught him. It defied everything they knew about horses. About instincts. About nature itself. But there it was. Undeniable. Thunder trusted Eli. And Eli trusted Thunder. Mr. Blake ran a hand over his face, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. Grace's heart was still hammering in her chest. She wanted to run to her son, to pull him off the horse and hold him tight. But she didn't. Because she saw something she had never seen before. Eli wasn't just riding Thunder. He was at peace. For the first time in his life, her son wasn't struggling to find his place. He wasn't uncomfortable, or uncertain, or lost in a world that didn't understand him. He had found where he belonged. And Thunder had chosen him. A sudden storm. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick and heavy. The wind picked up, rattling the barn doors. The workers glanced up. "Storm's comin'," one of them muttered. Mr. Blake frowned. It wasn't supposed to rain today. Tucker, who had remained silent since Thunder's impossible act, scoffed. "Ain't nothin'. Just a little wind." But he was wrong. The air grew electric. A sharp gust sent dust swirling through the ranch. In the distance, the first rumble of thunder shook the sky. And Thunder, the horse, not the storm, went still. Eli's small hands tightened on his mane. Then, a flash of lightning split the sky. The crack was deafening. The moment it struck, all the horses in the stables panicked. Neighs of fear filled the air. Hooves pounded against wooden stalls. Ranch hands ran to calm them down, shouting over the roaring wind. "Get them inside," Mr. Blake ordered. "Now." But Thunder didn't bolt. Didn't rear. Didn't panic. He stood firm, his eyes locked on Eli. And Eli? Eli did not flinch. He placed one hand on Thunder's neck and whispered something no one could hear. A second bolt of lightning flashed. Thunder snorted but did not move. Tucker's jaw dropped. "No way," he whispered. The boy and the stallion stood in the open, unshaken by the storm. It was as if the chaos around them didn't exist. The bond between them was stronger than fear. Mr. Blake exhaled, eyes shining. "I don't believe it," he murmured. Grace, tears in her eyes, whispered, "I do." For years, Eli had struggled to find where he fit in. The world was too loud, too fast, too full of things that didn't make sense. But not here. Not with Thunder. For the first time, Eli wasn't fighting to be understood. He already was. The wind howled. Rain began to fall. The storm raged on. But Eli and Thunder? They stood, together. Unbroken. Unshaken. Unstoppable. And then, as if fate itself had accepted what everyone else had finally realized. The storm passed. The clouds began to clear. The wind slowed. The ranch fell quiet again. And Thunder lowered his head, gently nudging Eli's cheek. The boy smiled. Tucker turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, damn," he muttered. Mr. Blake exhaled, looking at Grace. "That boy of yours," he said softly, shaking his head. "He's got a gift." Grace wiped her tears and smiled. "He always has." The ranch workers, once skeptical, now stood in quiet awe. Eli, the boy who had never quite fit into the world, had done the impossible. Not by force. Not by breaking. But by understanding. By listening. By simply being who he was meant to be. And Thunder, the untamable stallion, had found his match. But there was still one last thing to do. One final decision that would change everything. Mr. Blake turned to Grace, his expression serious. "Thunder belongs to that boy," he said. And in that moment, she knew. Everything was about to change. The ranch had never been the same since that day. The workers still spoke about it in hushed voices, how a wild, untamable stallion had chosen a quiet boy over the most experienced trainers. How, in the midst of a raging storm, the child had stood fearless while grown men had scrambled for shelter. But for Eli, none of it had been surprising. He had always known. Thunder was never wild. He was never broken. He was never a lost cause. He was just waiting. Waiting for someone who would listen. Someone who would understand him without trying to change him. And Eli, who had spent his whole life feeling like no one understood him, had given Thunder what no one else could. Patience. Trust. Love. The ranch's decision. Mr. Blake had spent decades training horses. He had seen everything, until now. He sat on the porch, watching as Eli sat beside Thunder's enclosure, running his fingers through the stallion's mane. Every morning, the boy arrived before sunrise. And every morning, Thunder waited for him. It wasn't just friendship. It was family. And Mr. Blake knew what had to be done. He stood up, exhaling through his nose, then walked over to Grace, who had been watching with tears in her eyes. "This boy," Mr. Blake said, adjusting his hat. "He's special." Grace smiled softly. "I know." The ranch owner studied Eli for a long moment, then let out a sigh. "I've seen plenty of men try to break that horse. They all failed. But your boy?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Your boy didn't have to." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Grace frowned. "What's this?" Mr. Blake placed the paper in her hands. His. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. It was a bill of sale. Except the price was scribbled out. Thunder, once worth thousands of dollars, was now listed at exactly $0. Her hands trembled. You're giving him to Eli." Mr. Blake took off his hat and nodded. "I ain't got no right to keep 'em apart. That horse ain't mine no more." Grace blinked back tears, gripping the paper to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Mr. Blake gave a gruff nod. "Don't thank me," he muttered. "It was never my decision to make." The final ride. When Eli saw the paper, he didn't react the way most boys would. He didn't jump up and down. He didn't shout in excitement. Instead, he simply turned to Thunder and rested his forehead against the stallion's. A silent promise. A moment of understanding. Then, for the first time, Eli placed a saddle on Thunder's back. The workers held their breath as he climbed up. This wasn't just a ride anymore. This was something bigger. Thunder snorted, shaking his mane, eager, ready. And then, with no reins, no spurs, no commands, the great stallion took off. Fast. Free. Unstoppable. But not alone. With Eli. The boy who had never quite fit into the world. Had finally found his place. The lesson that changed everything. The ranch was never the same after that. The workers stopped seeing Thunder as a wild beast. And they stopped seeing Eli as different. Instead, they saw the truth. Eli hadn't tamed Thunder. Thunder hadn't been tamed at all. He had just been waiting for someone who saw him for what he really was. And isn't that what we all want? To be seen. To be understood. To be loved, not for what we could be, but for who we already are. Mr. Blake watched the boy and the stallion disappear over the hills, riding as if they had been born for each other. And for the first time in his long, long life, he believed in something greater. Something that had nothing to do with training or breaking or control. Something simple. Something powerful. Trust. And from that day forward, whenever someone asked him about the wild horse that no man could tame, Mr. Blake would smile and shake his head. You don't tame a soul like that, he would say. You just have to let it run free.